At once Boromir stood up, tall and proud before them. Believe not that in the land of Gondor the blood of Númenor is spent, nor all its pride and dignity forgotten. By our valour the East and the terror of Morgul is kept at bay, and thus alone are peace and freedom maintained in the lands behind us, bulwark of the West. Why should we not think that this great ring has come into our hands to serve us in our very hour of need? The men of Gondor are valiant, and they will never submit, but they may be beaten down. Valour needs strength first, and then a weapon. Let the ring be your weapon, if it has such power as you say. Before we get into today's video, I just want to say a massive thank you to the dozens of you who have signed up to Patreon to support me. If you don't know, I had an onslaught of claims from Sony, many of them wrongful. They're clearly fair use, including some of my educational content, which means I don't get to make money off them anymore. I've had a total of 12 yesterday and then another 3 today. I'm disputing a couple, we'll see where that goes, but if you do want to support me, thank you very much, links down below, and really thank you to those of you who have and have bought the book. It makes my job, which is often so uncertain, a lot easier to do, and I don't have to be afraid of this stuff happening as much. Anyways, onto the video. Oh, and yes, I know that's not Boromir, only had Ned Stark, had to make do. You'll be right. Born in the year 2978 of the Third Age to Denethor II and Findulius, Boromir was the eldest son of the Steward of Gondor and the House of Hurin, at a time of a watchful unease for Gondor, ever their eye on the enemy who had declared himself in Mordor just 27 years earlier. And the House of Hurin actually has noble Númenorian blood in them, and they inherited a number of their traits and cultural influences, which began at birth. The name Boromir actually contains elements of the Elvish Sindarin word for steadfast, Boron, and the Quenya Elvish word for jewel, Mir. In other words, Boromir, steadfast jewel. And we know that even from a young age, Boromir grew up with a close relationship to his father, Denethor II, who loved him and mentored him for leadership one day. And during their childhood, it's important to know that his father was not the maddened steward that we see during the War of the Ring, though he did gradually come to see Middle-earth and the war in a very narrow way. Pride increased in Denethor, together with despair, until he saw in all the deeds of that time only a single combat, between the Lord of the White Tower and the Lord of the Barad-dûr. And this line is interesting, because we can see how Denethor's way of thinking of the war, as wholly between Gondor and Sauron, influenced the way that Boromir thinks, the way he presents it at the Council of Elrond. By our valour, the terror of Morgul is kept at bay, and by this alone are peace and freedom maintained in the lands behind us. He saw Gondor as the last bastion of noble men, and he was raised by a man that saw it that way. This is until Aragorn challenges him that Gondor was not the only one fighting against Sauron. But we also see that Boromir inherited another trait of Denethor's thinking, his mistrust, which is a symptom of Denethor's kind of growing isolation and madness throughout the story. But understanding this really important relationship and influence that Boromir has in his life, let's return to his childhood, which Tolkien gave some detail about, but not much. Boromir was 5 years old when Faramir was born in 2983, and it's this brotherly relationship that would become the foundation of his life, superseding even that of his relationship to Denethor. Despite their father's obvious favoritism for Boromir, this did not stop the two growing close as brothers in love and arms. Yet between the brothers there was a great love, and had been since childhood, when Boromir was the helper and protector of Faramir. No jealousy or rivalry had arisen between them since, for their father's favour or for the praise of men. And though Tolkien doesn't show us any interactions between Boromir and Faramir in The Lord of the Rings, it does seem that Boromir was acutely aware of Denethor's favouritism towards him, as well as his harshness towards Faramir, even from a young age, which really speaks to his character and his maturity. And I want to dwell on that description of their relationship, particularly the detail of Boromir being the helper and protector of Faramir. One line from Tolkien may give us some more insight as to what that really means. Faramir read the hearts of men as shrewd as his father, but what he read moved him sooner to pity than to scorn. He was gentle in bearing and a lover of law and of music. and therefore, by many in those days, his courage was judged less than his brother's. I suspect that description of him as the protector and helper of Faramir is about him standing up for Faramir's reputation, like a bigger brother in the schoolyard, both from those who would doubt Faramir's courage, and also from his father, who would bitterly undermine his successes, even from a young age it seems. Though others would look up to and focus on Boromir, Boromir would not let Faramir be left behind. He wouldn't let him miss out on opportunities. It seems pretty clear that Faramir was his closest and most beloved friend, his brother. But in understanding the nature of this brotherly relationship, it's important to see that it took root in tragedy, in the year 2988 of the Third Age, when their mother, Findulius, died. She withered in the guarded city, as a flower of the seaward vale set upon a barren rock. The shadow in the east filled her with horror, and she turned her eyes ever south to the sea that she missed. The death of Boromir's mother seems to have been a turning point in Boromir's life. Now, Denethor had always neglected Faramir. He had pretty much left Findulius to raise him herself, without any help. And it's because of this that when she died, Boromir took it upon himself to raise his younger brother, at just 10 years old, giving extra and real meaning to their description of him as a helper and protector. They developed an especial reliance on one another through shared tragedy. But that description of Faramir from before lies in sharp contrast to the description Tolkien gives us of Boromir, which also may give us some insight into why they had such a difficult family dynamic, why Denethor was so emotionally unavailable. Boromir, beloved by his father, was like him in face and pride but in little else. Rather, he was a man after the sort of King Eärnur of old, taking no wife and delighting chiefly in arms, fearless and strong, but caring little for lore save the tales of old battles. What I find interesting here is that Tolkien compares Boromir to King Eärnur, the 33rd and last true king of Gondor. He died in the year 2050 in a duel against the Witch King, with whom he had a vicious rivalry. The Witch King issued 3 challenges to him for a duel in single combat, and he turned them down each time before facing up to him on the 3rd one. And then he died. Now, this is partly conjecture on my part, but I see Denethor as a longing for the glory days of Gondor's past, and in a way, Boromir kind of represents the glorious Gondorians of old, while Faramir sort of represents what Denethor might see as the weaknesses of the day, listening to outsiders, to strangers, Mithrandir, Gandalf, when he, a true Gondorian, should be able to stand alone, and Faramir isn't as keen for a fight. He's not always seeking out the enemy, while Boromir is. Maybe Denethor kind of looks to Boromir in that part of him. Maybe there's an element of that in how he sees the two brothers. Because in both Boromir and Denethor, there is a hint of the vanity and arrogance of Ar-Pharazôn, the fallen king of the Númenóreans. And maybe this leads him to see Faramir's humility as a weakness. This is also in line with Tolkien's not philosophical approach, but mythological approach, where if the king is good and strong, then the kingdom will be prosperous and strong. And if Denethor sees Boromir as representative of strength and Faramir as weakness, then it's a no wonder that he sort of prefers one of them. Not justifying it, just trying to explore it. He treated Faramir horribly, obviously. Parenting tip: don't treat your kids like Faramir, like burning them alive. Or Boromir, don't send them into wars, that's a terrible idea. Pro parenting tip: don't be Denethor. And while Boromir was kind and loving and brave, he was also brash and quick for a fight. Tolkien noted that Faramir did not seek glory and danger without a purpose like Boromir. But this is his story. Even by his younger years, he was already captain of the White Tower, the head of the Gondorian forces, and the closest the kingdom had to a prince. But throughout all of this, he never forgot his brother. He never got too caught up in his father's praise or the people's love. So there was a degree of humility to him. Even if Denethor didn't recognize Faramir's successes, he would. He would keep him by his side. He would share his victories with him and his defeats. And this truly endearing and human side of him, we do see this throughout the Fellowship of the Ring.
Sorry! the Shire! Hold them! Don't me!
We cannot stay here! This will be the death of the hobbits!
I find those moments really curious because Aragorn's actually not the fatherly figure to the hobbits. He's not the one that takes on the more human, relatable role. Oddly enough, he's kind of distant while Boromir is there with them. I really like that Tolkien gave him that role. But this close brotherhood between Boromir and Faramir was truly tested in the year 3018 of the Third Age, when Sauron began the War of the Ring with an attack on Osgiliath. June 20th, when the enemy returned, our folk were driven from Ithilien, but we kept a foothold in Osgiliath. But this very year, sudden war came upon us out of Mordor and we were swept away. Only a remnant of our eastern force came back, destroying the last bridge that stood amid the ruins of Osgiliath. For over 100 years, the lands of Ithilien had been lost to Sauron's forces, but Gondorian men had successfully defended the half of Osgiliath on the eastern bank, preventing Sauron from using the remaining bridges to cross the Anduin and strike into the heart of Gondor. And while this was the first major engagement of the War of the Ring, this doesn't mean that Boromir had never faced down against Sauron's forces before. In fact, he, alongside Faramir, were probably escorting the final civilians westward, leading expeditions and raiding parties into Ithilien against Sauron's forces, commanding expeditions and fighting skirmishes in Ithilien, which would explain why the two of them were in command of the eastern forces during this attack on Osgiliath. They were positioned there on the front lines, just as it sort of seems that a prince should be in this kind of world. Tolkien gave relatively few details of either he or Faramir's role in this battle, but we do know that he faced down against the Witch King. We were outnumbered, for Mordor has allied itself with the Easterlings and the cruel Haradrim, but it was not by numbers that we were defeated. A power was there that we have not felt before. Some said that it could be seen, like a great black horseman. A dark shadow under the moon. Wherever he came, a madness filled our foes, but fear fell on our boldest. So that horse and man gave way and fled. At the arrival of the Witch King, their forces were pushed back to defend the final bridge across the river, with Boromir and Faramir amongst the last company there. Boromir gave the command to destroy the bridge beneath them, and he notes at the Council of Elrond that he and Faramir were two of only 4 survivors of the Eastern Force, only surviving by swimming. With this, the Eastern Bank had fallen, and the War of the Ring begun. But this period of Boromir's life had also taken a mystical turn, something in the books that wasn't included in the films. On the night before the attack on Osgiliath, Faramir had a prophetic dream. He shared the details with Boromir, and he had it many times after that. And finally, Boromir had it once as well. The eastern sky grew dark and there was a growing thunder, but in the west a pale light lingered, and out of it I heard a voice. Seek the sword that was broken, in Imladris it dwells. There shall be counsels taken, stronger than Morgul's spells. There shall be shown a token that doom is near at hand, for Isildur's bane shall waken, and the halfling forth shall stand. And puzzled by their dreams, they went to the wisest man they knew, Denethor. Clearly, no, really, in the books, he is wise. He's just kind of a dick. It's also noted that, like, Faramir talks to Gandalf and counsels him, so it's like, who's our wisest guy? Oh, you know, Dad, not the immortal wizard guy. Then again, they probably don't have, like, his number. Or wasn't available at the time. Either way, Denethor explained to them that Imladris was Rivendell, but he didn't know what the Doom was, so they were kind of getting a bit worried. And I actually think that this is one of the more telling moments of Boromir's character. When Faramir wished to leave for Rivendell alone, Boromir stopped him, and he took the journey upon himself, fearing that the road was full of doubt and danger, which it would turn out to be. All for the love of his brother. Denethor, of course, tried to dissuade him, but Boromir defied him, and he left the forces of Gondor in the hands of Faramir, much to his father's loathing. Why I find this interesting is that it's highlighted many times that Denethor preferred Boromir because of his loyalty, or some idea of his loyalty. But here, Boromir is defying him for clearly the one thing that's more important, the love of his brother. But I want to take a moment to explore why Boromir and Faramir had these dreams, because we're never told who they came from Eru Ilúvatar, the Valar, Tom Bombadil, Gollum, with a Palantir. Who knows? We're not even told what the voice sounded like. But both of these brothers are technically of Númenórean descent, and Númenóreans did have the power of foresight. Foresight being the ability to sense things of importance or see the future and such things as visions and dreams like we have here. Perhaps it wasn't sent by someone else, it was just a symptom of maybe a leftover power in their bloodline of foresight, something that needed to tell them to go to Rivendell. But whether or not it was foresight or sent by Eru or who knows what else, there is still an important question to think about here. Given that Faramir was the one to receive the dream many times, perhaps dozens of times, before Boromir received it once, was Faramir meant to be the one to go to Rivendell? And what would have happened if that did happen? What if he went to Rivendell? Was this an example of destiny being inadvertently averted just because Boromir's sense of self-sacrifice and not wanting to put his brother in danger? Whatever the truth was, the journey took Boromir 110 days, and it proved incredibly difficult. The north-south road was broken, many bridges had been shattered, and in crossing 7 rivers he lost his horse at the Grey Flood near Tharbad. And even in reaching the foreign north, Boromir became lost for a time before he finally found Rivendell. Which fits in with Tolkien's implication that Rivendell is sort of magically hidden from those who would do it harm or haven't been invited. And part of Boromir's signature look is the Great Horn. We call it the Horn of Gondor, but it doesn't actually have a name in the books. It's an heirloom of the House of Turin, made from Kinehorn, a sort of oxen thing down in Rhun. And heirlooms are traditionally passed down when a person reaches manhood, which would have been some 20 years earlier, around the year 3000 of the Third Age, and his lines in Fellowship of the Ring do imply he's had it for quite some time. I had this whole spiel on whether or not the Great Horn was magical, but that felt like a separate video because it's not directly related to Boromir. Either way, as another note of speculation about Boromir's story, I want to talk about his name. We know that he was named after Boromir the First, who was the steward of Gondor from 2477 to 2489 of the Third Age. What's really interesting, what's really curious and got my conspiracy mind ticking, is that they share an incredibly similar story, right down to the details, as in all of the details that we have on Boromir First pretty much fit in with Boromir the Second. They were both known as a great captain of Gondor. They both faced down against the Witch King during a fight to defend Osgiliath. And just as Boromir II's battle ended with the destruction of the final bridge to the eastern bank, Boromir I ended in a similar way. Osgiliath was finally ruined, and its great stone bridge was broken. So there used to be this grand bridge that crossed at its heart, full of stone towers and stuff. Likewise, both Boromir I and Boromir II would die of wounds dealt to them by the Uruk-hai. And so the question becomes, why do they share the same name as well as such a similar story? And one idea did come to mind. Curiously, Boromir's mother's line carries elvish blood. And the reason I bring this up is a phenomenon called Amilsi. So, elven mothers have the ability to sense the abilities, the personalities, and the futures of their children, and to give them a name that appropriately reflects that. This may be an example of that. Here she recognized that certain things would happen in the future, or got a feeling about it, and gave him a name that reflected a similar story. Though definitely not an elf, maybe the blood inside Finduilas left a remnant of that ability that led to such a curious and fateful naming. But that's just my thoughts, more food for thought. What do you think of it? Let me know down below. A degree of speculation. And from this point, we have a better understanding of Boromir. His desire for the ring comes from a place of love, for his people and for others whom he sees on the front lines. A misguided belief perhaps, but not one that should be wholly dismissed. More importantly though, I think Boromir's role in the story is really important.
Leaves more time for drinking.
Aragorn might be who we should strive to be, but Boromir's more like who we are, in all of our flaws and our noble traits, in our bravery and in our recklessness. And that's all from me. Thank you so much to those of you who have signed up at Patreon. Really hard to explain kind of how much that means and what Patreon allows me to do. It means that I don't have to be as worried, and I don't have to be as beholden to the corporate overlords. You know, either way, thank you. The Discord community's grown hugely. It's really cool to see. Either way, stay nerdy. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you want to see down below, and I will see you I feel like with that, he's gonna drop a 60s Careless Whisper, soft singing saxophone album. Okay. Moving on.